Sort of.
Hey, man.
All right.
You still got a good rosy color.
Yeah, it's not great yet. Whoa, I am so loud.
I'll bring it down. Okay.
All right. So, let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for your kindness to us. Thank you that you brought the Caines safely back from New York, and I pray that you would help Allie to be able to quickly settle back into life here in Tennessee. We pray to help them to recover from their trip. And we ask that you would be with us tonight, that you would guide us into truth, and that you would help us as we discuss to really understand ourselves and you better. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, it's good to be with you all tonight. So for the chapter we're working on today is a chapter on, have you read this book? No. Yeah, it's the chapter on mothers. So the kind of question is, what do I want when I want to leave? And when Philip asked me to fill in for him this week, I said, he said, I think the chapter we're on is the mother's chapter, and I said, don't we have to skip some chapters because we aren't going to have enough time to do the whole book? Like, wouldn't this be a good one to skip? And he said, oh, well, my brother read this book just recently, and he said that chapter was the one that really, spoke to him the most. So I don't think we want to skip it. So I've been spending the last week and a half trying to figure out what Philip's brother saw in this chapter. But, there are some good things in it. It's just, after last week, how could it be any more exciting than that? I don't know, all right, so,
Sam seemed pretty graphic about how
But then he stopped.
yeah, no, we haven't,
when he was at it.
all right, so, there are several themes kind of in this chapter that are kind of work together with each other. And the first is kind of, this history of Augustine leaving his mother, and when he leaves her, he wants to get as far away as possible because he wants to live a life of unrestrained, kind of pursuit of pleasure, that kind of thing. And, I think it's interesting, kind of something we can maybe talk about a little bit later, but just how, now at my stage in life, I've kind of experienced this on both ends, right? As a son leaving his mother, and then as a father watching my children leave their mother, and, and so I think as fathers, we don't have quite the same experience of it. I don't know what is going on with this mic, but I feel like I'm just echoing all over the place. Anyway, but...
we're going to be working against the children here shortly.
Oh, okay, so we want it to be loud. Okay, whatever. Anyway, I was just curious, I think in our culture, we have this, strong bent towards independence, and it starts really early. It's not normal in most of the rest of the world for kids to have their own bedroom. We think, you can't, how can we live without our kids having each their own bedroom? But most people in the world don't live like that. And, certainly when we lived in Moscow, most people were living several generations in very small apartments. And so kids slept with their parents until they were actually older than you would think kids should be sleeping with their parents, so there wasn't the same kind of sense that you really had to be independent. But, the whole American thing about, and it's not just America, but I think as kids age, they do need to sort of individuate, they have to kind of realize that they're separate from their parents and their life isn't going to be exactly like their parents, and they have to make decisions that are independent of their parents. But I think in America we're even, we really elevate that, you've got to go, and you've got to, but transition for parents, mothers for sure. But I'm just curious, like, your own experience about, like, leaving and, you know, when you left, did you feel like you were so glad to get away out of the suffocating embrace? What does he call it? Her presence swells and overwhelms and inhales all the oxygen an independent self needs to breathe. Does that like ring any bells for you, or? I don't, like, personally, I don't feel like I was desperate to get away from my mother when I was a teenager. But I think it's partially because my mom, her mother was a total suffocating kind of presence in her life, and was, you know, I think actually mentally ill. But so when my mom left home, she was so ready to be away from that. And she vowed to herself that she would never interfere in her children's lives the way her mother did. And so she really didn't. She was like, she wasn't distant, she's as warm and loving as possibly could be, but she would not like interfere in decisions we were making or whatever. She just prayed for us. And so I don't remember really having a time when I just wished I could get away from my parents. But I think that's kind of unusual, I don't know.
I'm one of four, and I know my younger brother would say, I couldn't get away quick enough.
Yeah.
Because he did one semester at Cleveland State, and that had him at the house, and he couldn't get away quick enough. I don't recall for me personally, mine couldn't get away quick enough. It was more from high school.
Oh,
Taking the school I was at. Everything I was ready to do was move to college, to career, that was my path. Now I can tell you, live a stone's throw away from my mother right now. Her philosophy was, and she got it from my father, was my role is to get these guys kicked out of this nest as quick and as independent as possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
World of minds. But each sibling
He responded differently. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Was he an only child?
Augustine?
Yeah.
No, they had a brother.
I think there was a
Yeah,
brother
okay.
there too.
I
Yeah.
just don't remember him coming into the story much, but just kind of curious.
I guess there's something, it was like one of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And we don't, as far as I can tell, we don't really have his
Perspective on
part of the story, because like each kid is so different. So often the one who's itching to get out of the house, maybe the other one is fine.
Yeah. Any others of you? I thought it was interesting on page 107 that he says, fathers you can leave, but the reach of mothers transcends geography and chronology. And like my immediate thought when I thought of that was people I've known, like men in particular that I've known, who spent their entire lives trying to prove to their fathers that they were somebody, so they never really left their father in that sense. I mean, like in an emotional sense, it was a presence that was always there. I mean, I think of one guy who was one of my professors in grad school, and I ended up knowing their family really closely, but his father was just terrible. I mean, like, even though he was a missionary doctor, but he just like told his son constantly that he was never going to amount to anything, and that he was just, worthless and this kind of thing. And this guy ended up being like really elite scholar. I mean, like really in his field, he is still like a name that you have to quote kind of thing, because he's just like super, super intelligent and, accomplished a great deal in his life. Now he's in his early 80s, but he lived with that kind of burden of his father's opinion of him even long after his father was dead. you know. So I'm not sure that we leave our fathers as much as this book is indicating. But it is a different kind of relationship. It does seem to me that when people leave their mothers, they often find that they have a new appreciation for their mothers when they start having children of their own, have a little bit more of a sense of what it cost their mother to raise them, you know, and give birth to them. But anyway. All right, so on the bottom of page 108, he's been kind of talking about these other North Africans like Camus and Derrida, who had, you know, mothers in North Africa too, or in Santa Monica, California, as the case may be. But one of them, I forget which one of them, said that he had a pain in his mother. Augustine could identify, he says at the bottom of that page, but that pain might be a symptom of a deeper issue, the challenge of negotiating an identity without effacing the dependence that makes us human. Mothers are a reminder of both, which is why they are so often a foil. So, I mean, he's kind of, I mean, like the direction the chapter takes then is, like how do we go about doing this? And it reminded me, like it kind of brought to mind for me a lot of the books that we've been reading in various book groups lately. We've been reading lots of books in book groups lately. But just about, especially how our culture, and this is why it's kind of surprising how modern Augustine seems, you know, but in our culture, we have moved in the direction of this kind of expressive individualism, you know, where the greatest good is like defining yourself, you know, kind of like creating your identity, you know, saying who you are. And like there is no questioning that, you know, like and so, I mean, I think our whole culture, like, is feeding us this constant message, you know, that you've got to shape your own self, you've got to make your own decisions, you've got to be independent, and, you know, only you can know what is good for you. And whenever I think that, I think about my own experience of going to restaurants, you know, where I always pick the wrong thing. I have no idea what's the best thing for me, you know, like, and I don't think anybody does really, you know, on their own without help of a community. But I mean, this kind of pressure that we are under to shape our identity can lead us into some really bad places without the Lord's intervention. But at the same time, there is a sense where we have to kind of discover who we are or what we're good at doing, or, you know, like there is an aspect of that where we have to kind of, I don't know, figure out what our life is, you know, and I mean, even a part of that is figuring out how God fits into that picture, you know, that because we aren't born as fallen creatures with an understanding of how, you know, God redeems us, or, you know, and redeems the fallenness of our lives. So I don't know. I've just been trying to. This week I've been thinking about like where is the boundary line where I cross over into saying, you know, I belong to myself and I'm going to create myself, and recognizing that God has sovereignly been working in my life, but along the way I've been in a process of discovering who I really am too, you know, like in understanding my identity. Does that resonate with anybody?
That's interesting, that they go on all of that. I mean, that's kind of what it starts on here as far as the mom having power over who he is, right?
Mm-hmm.
She even sets this course for him. A beautiful son, you know, imagine the team that goes after her.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But that's in the generation, two generations ago, before that, it's like the old,
Yeah, I think that's true. And certainly my mother, even though, like as I said, she's kind of a little hands-off, she's extremely empathetic, you know, so she's the kind of person that you love to sit down next to and tell everything about what's going on in your life because she's such a great listener, you know, really encouraging, well, what happened then, you know, like this kind of on the edge of her seat, you know, about all the stupid things that you're telling her about your boring life, you know, but yeah, and you know, I mean, my dad is an amazing Christian man too, and I, you know, I would say that he was affirming, you know, like I didn't grow up in a situation where I feel like he loved me or cared for me, but he isn't nearly as expressive as my mother, you know, and so that I can think back of some specific times where he actually like communicated something that he normally wouldn't communicate, you know, about how he felt about how I had done or whatever. When I defended my dissertation for my PhD, I had told a friend of mine that I just wanted to go out to dinner after it was over with two couples that we were close with at that time and just celebrate together, you know. So my good friend, who was one of those two, said, "Oh, I'll arrange everything. Don't worry about it. I'll just take care of it." You know, I should have known better. But so he like invited everybody who had ever known me, you know, to come to this huge dinner and you know, have a big celebration together. And it was great, and you know, I enjoyed it. But I mean, I really did think it was a great idea to go out to dinner with just two couples. But so they invited my dad, and my dad and mom didn't come because at that moment my dad was on a 40-day fast and didn't want to go sit in a restaurant all evening. But he sent an email to be read at this meeting, and it was a really moving email. I mean, because he, you know, he talked about in the message that, you know, when I left after high school to go join a mission organization, and, you know, he had to kind of, as a professor himself, he had to kind of like die to this idea of his son becoming something academically, you know, that, you know, it just is so meaningful to him, was so meaningful to him at that time that even though I took this sort of unorthodox path and was doing YWAM for 7.5 years instead of going to college, the Lord finally like brought it around, and I ended up doing, you know, 3 degrees back to back and got a PhD in the end. And you know, he just expressed how pleased he was that I had followed the Lord rather than just doing the traditional thing, you know, or doing the next thing that everybody else was doing, kind of thing. And that was such a powerful moment in my life, you know, and I still remember it. And so, I mean, I could tell you probably hundreds of different times my mother has affirmed me, but I don't have a specific memory in the way that I do of that moment when my dad expressed his, you know, sort of validation of what my life path had been like. Anyway.
So do
Okay.
you want your kids to have the memory of the one moment that you did that for them, or do you want to?
Be more affirming.
Yeah, give them a million little examples.
Well, it depends on the child we're talking about.
Some of them are still waiting.
Yeah, this is being recorded, by the way.
I know, I need to be careful what I say.
I don't know, what's kind of standing out to me is that we're in a chapter on mothers, but our dads keep coming up.
Yeah.
That might be worth talking about. But I was also wondering, like, as his experience with his mom is his experience with his mom, and we can relate to that maybe more or less depending on our own relationship. It seems like what Smith is trying to get at is this issue beneath, like whether your relationship with your mom looks like his or is more like yours, like very affirming and permissive in a healthy way, like, hey, you know, I'm just here to support you on your path. is there still a sense where this desire to leave is functioning? And where mother, whether she's supportive or controlling, can still represent some sort of, impediment to that leaving or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. Maybe some of you have your own experiences with this. I mean, I would say that when I left home, I was eager to leave. I was ready to go have adventures and do new things. But I wasn't leaving kind of to get away from something. I was going to something rather than getting away from something, if that makes sense. And, unlike Augustine, like my purpose in leaving home was not to go, find as many available women as I could, or, something like that. It's a very different kind of experience, but I do think there still is something about, like, needing to leave, I don't know. I'm not answering your question, but what about the rest of you? What do you think?
Taking back a little bit to a podcast Laura and I listened to a little bit after retreat, and it was a young man that lives in Hawaii, and was kind of talking about the downturn of American society and the family unit. He said, if you ask anybody now, the family unit is, leave it to Beaver. Believers, and then everybody takes off to their next adventures. And he said, but prior to that, the States and other parts of the world, the family unit is sometimes 3 generations within the family. And so then you're dealing with mother, grandmother, maybe great-grandmother. And wow, could I imagine what those dynamics would have been. But it was just an interesting way. We always think about we're here to push them out of the nest, but is that the way God really designed us? We got Adam and Eve. That offspring collapsed, but other family units after that tend to be more communal. This is where it took me a little bit, thinking, the mother unit, we're talking here, the father unit, for me, I'm going, maybe that's justification for not giving so many praises, because then hey, at least remember the ones you do get.
Yeah, right.
But, you do try to, I've tried to, and each one of us do, how we raise their kids, how our kids each responded differently. In what order they came, how far they were apart. So like back to my mother, how she raised me, and how she raised my little brother. I recall more of Martin Fitz. He was Augustine. We're being recorded. No, I was actually gone. I was, my brother and I 9 years apart. So we were 2 separate. Like those. He's sitting here sending me blue stuff right now because he got one.
Where this chapter really got interesting to me is where he begins, like once he gets to Milan, and he's interacting with Ambrose, and then all of a sudden Monica shows up, his mom shows up, and he's really embarrassed of his mom. Her kind of backwater ways, her pursuing him, still kind of feeling like she's trying to control him, and then, and she brings even some of her theological error with her, like some of her superstitions. And Ambrose, like he gently corrects her, and she receives that correction, And Ambrose praises her to Augustine. And what does he say? Like, not knowing what kind of son, like he praised my mother, not knowing what kind of son she had in me.
Right.
Like he sees his mother as one who has kind of gotten there ahead of him in a way. Like he's been chasing a claim for how long now? And yet here's Ambrose praising her, where she kind of represents everything that he thinks is backwards. But like that just, like him getting to see his mom through another's eyes really begins to transform him in his relationship with his mom. It kind of brings her back together. It just kind of makes me, like when I was reading it, it made me think obviously about my relationship with my own mom. Like, okay, for all the things that maybe I don't understand, or like, you know, kind of bristle a little bit, either in the past or in the present. It's like, you know, can I see my mom through the Lord's eyes? And even if there is something that's wrong in the way that, you know, like sort of who am I to judge her? Like, if the Lord praises her faithfulness, like shouldn't I appreciate that too? And shouldn't I see something in that of our Father's kind of motherly pursuit of us, if I can use that language? Like, the scriptures do talk about God's kind of motherly qualities.
Yeah, he mentions a sermon by Augustine that kind of emphasizes that aspect of things too. It's like maternal love expressed as weakness. Let's see. Indeed, years after Monica's, this is page 117 if you're trying to follow. Indeed, years after Monica's death, Augustine preaching a sermon in Carthage considers the mother-like grace of God and the godlike virtue of maternal devotion. He's meditating on Jesus' promise to gather the chicks of Jerusalem under his wings, like a hen that is weakened with her babies. He is struck by the power of maternal weakness, the saving power of the one who humbled himself, a power that mothers exhibit every day. This is maternal love expressing itself as weakness, he tells his congregation. All this is the mark of a mother's weakness, not of lost majesty. The mother, in other words, is an icon of the incarnation, the central mystery of the faith in which the God of the universe would humble God's self, become human, and take on our sin and brokenness. And so, I think it's an interesting... It is part of the power of the gospel that Jesus became weak in order to exhibit his power, it's in that moment of weakness that he most exhibits his power.
Yeah, and the selflessness of it. One of the first times, one of the first preaching classes I had at Covenant was at the Covenant Presbyterian Church in St. Louis, which was actually, Francis Schaeffer was the pastor there for a little bit. When they did a renovation, they found the pulpit and basically restored it, and it's now the main pulpit. And the carving on the front of it is an ancient symbol that Christians use, the image of Christ. And it's a pelican feeding its young, which apparently in times of want, like when the fishing's bad, the pelican will actually pull feathers out from its own breast, so feeding the chicks with its own flesh. And like that kind of weakness, sacrificial love, like mothers do exhibit that, and so they're like a sign of grace.
Yeah, well, I always think, of course, of Kathy in the midst of this conversation as well, because, for her, she loved the little stages, with our kids. She was so good at babies and, that kind of thing. And the transition from, your kids basically worshiping the ground you walk on to all of a sudden like rolling their eyes at you and being kind of contemptuous of how, pathetic you are kind of thing. I mean, that was a hard transition for her. And all of our kids went through it, kind of this stage, and some of them are still not completely out of it, but I mean, just a stage where mom is kind of mom, it's interesting to watch her. As painful as that has been for her, it doesn't change the fact that she still would do anything for those kids, and thinks about them all the time, and is constantly anticipating what they need, even to this day, even though they're adults and out of the house, like she's constantly thinking of ways that, we should be caring for them. And I think that that's an interesting picture, like as he's pointing out here, just that, the attitude of my teenage children when they started being contemptuous of their mother is a kind of distorted view of reality. Even though, their mother may not always, have the witty repartee or something that they admire or whatever it is that they, she likes to, have family game time kind of things, and they're like, oh, no way, mom, I'm not doing that, kind of response. But she just really has amazingly godly character, and has gone through some experiences in life, even early in her life, that are just horrific, I mean, she lost a sister that was 2 years younger than her, when Kathy was, I think, 10, and her sister was 8. They both went in to have tonsillectomies, and her sister didn't make it through the surgery. The doctor cut a little too deeply when he was taking out the tonsils, and then staunched the blood with cocaine, which was, I guess, something that they did back in those days. And it stopped her heart, and she never recovered. And so when she lost her sister when she was 10, and then her mom died when she was about 16 of cancer. And then as an adult, living in Russia was no walk in the park, with 4 small children. And, it wasn't like we were backing up a minivan to the supermarket every day. Every bite that we ate, she carried from somewhere up, to the 11th floor of our apartment, walking long distances from, the markets and that kind of stuff. I mean, it was, really hard life. And, then particularly with some of our children's issues, she has endured some really incredible things. And, so, I see, in our children, I see growing appreciation for who she is and, what she's done for them, and I'm grateful to see that, But I think it's a picture of this, it's this kind of self-sacrificial love that gives even when, what she's getting back is tearing her to pieces, kind of thing. And, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, he mentions after his conversion, bottom of 116, Augustine focusing in on the grieving widow approaching Jesus. Jesus actually approaching her. There's different stories where Jesus is interacting with widows who have lost their sons, and even just noticing that Jesus is the one who sees and has compassion on this motherly love and grief is instructive, I think, because it's easy, like with Augustine and with me, it's easy to focus on the negative. It's easy to focus on, that feeling
leads us into the other thing that I think is kind of a main point that he's trying to make here, which is that we are actually dependent on others, and that we need to acknowledge that dependence and not think that we are just ourselves, that we are responsible for everything. But let's see. At the very end of the chapter, he says, Augustine had learned that being himself meant depending on others, a lesson his mother had been showing him his whole life. I have a pain in my mother, as he quotes again, is finitude's thorn in the flesh, an embodied reminder of the dependence that characterizes creaturehood. I'm reading this other book right now, which I brought with me today. It's called You're Only Human. And he actually kind of expands on this a little bit. And so I thought I'd read a little bit of this if you don't mind.
Is it the same guy?
No, this is Kelly Kapik
Oh, the guy
from Covenant, yeah. Anyway, he says, and this is a little bit long, but I think it's worth it. And yet we occasionally hear it said, he is a self-made man, or no one helped me or gave me anything. I am an independent person not needing anyone. Self-made? Really? No belly button? And he's referring there to an earlier story. He tells about what he tells his students is to go home and look at their belly button someday and reflect on the fact that they did not get here by themselves, Anyway. The people who use these expressions will obviously deny intending any such implication, but we experience a cultural pressure to be, if not exactly self-made, then at least self-sufficient. We tend to admire the driven individual who seeks personal triumph more than we do the relational person who is embedded within a community. Both people clearly depend on others, but one ignores that fact, whether he buys eggs, puts on clothes, or appreciates his former teachers, while the other expresses gratitude and gives credit to those who are essential to his flourishing. But the story of the isolated hero is much easier to tell than the complicated narrative of community and mutual relations, so we focus on the superheroes. And I think that's really profound, but he goes on, false narratives distort our imaginations. Did the great mathematicians, artists, and philosophers truly work alone, needing no one and nothing besides their own genius to achieve greatness? Stories that describe them that are way more myth than history. Stories that describe them that way are more myth than history. Randall Collins has written a massive study on the sociology of philosophies, which investigates the less obvious and easy to forget networks and relationships behind these individual contributions. He discusses Plato, Descartes, Ibn Sina, Abu Ali Sina, I don't know who those people are, Al-Ghazali, and many others, all of whom drew heavily not just from past sources, but from their contemporary networks and relationships. It's just easier to single out a brilliant and articulate individual than to trace the contributing influences and support. Individuals do not stand apart from society as if they are what they are without ever having interacted with anyone. The particularity of the individual is the particularity of the social path. In Protestant circles, we often tell the story of Martin Luther as if he were a lone figure who came up with the idea of justification by faith alone, by himself, and yet the evidence shows that the Reformation was initiated by the Wittenberg theological faculty as a whole, with Luther serving as the brilliant and distinctly gifted figurehead. Moving from theology to pop music, let's just pick one easy illustration. Elvis was often credited with utter originality in his dance and sound, yet his work drew heavily on many others, including black R&B singers and performers like Jackie Wilson and Chuck Berry. Even if we don't realize it, we all constantly depend on others, whether in developing our talents or filling our stomachs. From our laughter to the reproduction of the species, from learning accounting to acquiring skill in carpentry, all of it points to reciprocity and interdependence. I really thought when I was reading that this morning, in fact, I thought, oh, how timely, but I just thought that really expressed it well. This idea that we are part of a community. We need to be part of a community. And even if we don't recognize that we are, because it's impossible for us to exist without a community. And so, like this is part of what Augustine had to learn in, dealing with his mother, was that she was a part of who he was, whether he wanted to acknowledge it or not. And it was much better to acknowledge it and to express, loving appreciation to her for her part than it was to continue to pretend as though he was an independent man who had no connections to anybody else. And, as I was reading this, of course, I was thinking of Rodney Hodges and the decisions that they've been working through as a family about, do we stay here or do we look for jobs elsewhere? And it's, really and truly scary to be without a job and not sure how everything's going to work out. But this is not the first time that their family has made a decision to forego, opportunities in order to remain committed to the community that they're part of here. And I just think that's a beautiful decision. It's totally against everything that our culture sells. It's just not what people do in America. We go pursue the most money we can get, the biggest status we can get, and who cares if there's any community attached, And I've become more and more convinced over the last few years just how absolutely vital it is for us to not just be part of a community, like go to church every Sunday, but to stick with a community over the long haul so that we really get to know people, and we have we just have a network of care and mutual support and knowledge of each other that makes it possible for us to really thrive as humans. And if you've never had that, then you have no way of knowing what you're missing. It's only when you invest in relationships in that way for a long period of time that you realize, this is really worth doing. And, I feel like in my own experience, I'm just barely scratching the surface by, I've only lived here for going on 8 years now, but I get a little taste of it when I go back to my parents' church. At Christmas, we were just up there. And there are people in that church that have known me since I was in high school or even younger, and they have followed my entire career with interest because they know my family and, they care about my dad was a pastor for many years in this church. And there's just something about going back to a place where people know who you are, that's really wonderful. And, when we first moved here, this was a part of what I felt the loss of the most when we were first living here was that, we had an old friend from Moscow had come and visited, and it wasn't even somebody that we were that close to, but we had an hour-long conversation, and it was just so meaningful to talk with somebody who knew who we were, knew what we'd been through and what we accomplished, and that kind of stuff, and what we'd suffered and what our victories were, and all this kind of stuff. It was just that was, and whereas to everybody here at that point, now I've talked to you all to death of all my stories, but at that point, as far as everybody was concerned, I was a blank page until the day I showed up in Cleveland, There wasn't any history there, and so I don't know, obviously this is something I'm constantly harping on, but I just think it's so important that we make whatever sacrifices we need to stay plugged into community. And I love the fact that Trinity, I think, does this quite well, better than a lot of churches that I've been exposed to. But I think we have to keep reaching, keep making it better. Okay, I just talked for a really long time. Any reactions?
Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
The whole thing with relationships in that long
That book is a slog.
Where did you kind of get?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think I had the same reaction to the book that some of us are reading on Thursday, You Are Not Your Own Book. At the end, like when he's just kind of like talking about the implications of the fact that we belong to God, it sort of struck this note of community again as well. You know, kind of we don't only belong to God, we belong to one another, and if we understand that, that changes the way we react and interact.
You know, in Nashville, there's 900 churches, but there's 3 PCA churches. They're all they're people with lots of people. Scott Sauls' church, Grace Press, Chad Scruggs' church at Covenant, and Carter Crenshaw's church at West End. And there's a lot of cross-pollination with those people with the label, which is a beautiful thing. And it's not like those people live on Wildwood yet, they haven't either. I mean, these are people with means, but they understand that we are stewards of all this and not others. And you can just, you just feel a genuineness there. But they have the resources if there's a need that needs to be met. I mean, the people are there in space.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Any thoughts?
What kind of strikes me is to the extent that we grasp how much we need community, how dependent we are on others, from our moms to other, all our life together in the church. Like to the extent that we grasp that, we should be wanting others to grasp that as well, but understanding that not everybody gets that yet. Like so many people are still functioning with that kind of independent mindset. Like, if you apply that to spirituality, it's kind of a me and Jesus kind of mentality. It takes all kinds of forms, but this is really an opportunity for those of us who do enjoy the community that God's provided for us to be outward faced and seeking to bring others in. It's gonna take work. It's gonna take sacrifice. It's gonna take a lot of patience because most of us didn't really come to this place of understanding our need for other people overnight. But we get to be the sort of a picture of that motherly pursuing love for other people. That's something that I want Trinity to do as a church.
You know, I don't know, the women had a retreat, some of your spouses were on a retreat. So I had a list of the mothers who were part of that. And I wrote down on a piece of paper their spouses, and then I wrote their children down. And I'll just say there were 25 there, maybe there was about. But just going out that far, which isn't far, because those people don't even know exactly. There were 96 people, if you just counted the participant, their spouse, and their dependent children. Some have kids off to college. We have 10 or 11 families that are paying for at least one kid to go. Somebody pays for them to go off to school, and there's a wide range of how much that costs, but it costs a lot of money. Even if they're just getting new blue jeans and a backpack. Like the old days. So with that, I think we need to do more of this kind of thing as far as, mothering is that's a revered profession. It doesn't have to be able to just do that on the side. Let the man take care of it. No, it doesn't work that way. These moms are like, they've got 2 balls in the air most of the time. So just, you want to be sensitive.
Yeah, and I think, they often find it difficult to get community. Like they have times to do things like the retreat and that kind of stuff, so where we can fill in or whatever so that they can have opportunities to be together with other women in that community. I think that's a great investment in there.
Yeah, to even be willing to deprive myself for a time to give that gift to my wife.
Have her pre-make some meals.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Just kidding.
Yes. Other thoughts? Yeah.
What you said earlier about coming to Cleveland, not knowing anybody, that resonated a lot, because we made an active choice to move here about a year ago, to move to Cleveland, Tennessee. It's not just like in the area, but to Cleveland, Tennessee. And several of you know the reasons why. But where we came from Tampa, Florida, that's where I wasn't born there, but I was raised there since I was 5 years old, so that was home. And while living at home, I never had that need or drive that, oh, I need to get away from here. My parents were great. I love my parents. They were loving, a loving couple to me and my brother. And while they were, yes, parents, and I mean, I didn't get annoyed with them, there's never an overbearing reason to leave home. Ultimately, I did. I've often been pragmatic in my choices. I figured it's cheaper to live at home until I get married, and so on and so forth. But the choice that we made to come here was almost one of those choices that I would have made as a 22-year-old to leave home, or as an 18-year-old, because we were leaving everything and everyone in our community that we knew in Tampa. And that was the one big negative side to leaving Tampa, was that we have our life here, our family, our friends, people who have seen us struggle and we've seen them struggle and so on and so forth and grow in the Lord. In fact, that's part of the chore of going back to Tampa, is that we have to see everybody for the next week.
Yeah.
So all of that just kind of came together for me just now in this discussion, because there's kind of, again, kind of a delayed leave the family, leave your community that you know in order to move on and do these greater things that you hope for as you move on. But knowing that when we came here, one of our first chores or first things to do was to find a community within our children's school, within a church. And thank God that He's provided that. But without having or knowing that we had to come somewhere to actively look for that, it would have been a difficult move. It would have been a difficult relocation. And almost to a depressing part, because then you go somewhere that you don't know anyone or really have no connection to. You know, when we go back to Tampa, there is connection. That's a life that I've spent there. My wife spent half her life there. So it was a big choice and decision, and that journey, is just something that we have to come back and depend on a community, a God-given community such as the church.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, what you were saying, Sam, about being outward focused or whatever, I mean, I think that like when you find good community and then you get close to people, it's very easy to kind of like, I'm really liking these relationships the way they are. I don't really want to bring anybody else in that doesn't know us and, isn't part. And yet, I mean, like we see this kind of outward looking love of Christ, like He's always going out. And I was in a chapel just yesterday where the speaker was talking about, like the passage where Jesus says, when you invite people to your house kind of thing, don't invite your friends and family. Invite people you don't know who can't give it back to you, kind of thing. And I thought that's kind of a pretty direct command to do this very thing we're talking about. It's kind of like do this outward kind of love, where we're reaching out to others, even though it costs us a little bit of something in terms of the time we're spending with people that we'd rather spend time with, kind of thing. But I also think that, part of the way that we build community is just by making it so attractive to other people that they want a part of it, you know? Like, it's maintaining those relationships and really caring about each other, and, you know, those kind of genuine friendships and relationships speaks a lot to other people. Like, it does say something to them about, you know, where we are, and that there's something attractive and appealing there, and makes them hunger for some of that too. You know, I think that's, so there's kind of both sides to it. We keep working on building and maintaining community, because we want that to be the kind of environment that people want to come to, but at the same time we keep reaching out to others and inviting them in, you know, letting them be a part.
Part of it is, I think there's one other area you discussed one time. I sit in awe sometimes of the different faces. So we've got a couple that have been visiting a little bit that were part of my circle and raised the kids. And so to hear them look, or to have a conversation with them, of seeing the totally different faces. And kudos to you guys, keep it up. One of the things Laura and I learned our first year of marriage when we were at PCA trips that was driving us nuts and just cold. But we were challenged and told, you get as much out of something as you put into it. And you guys are doing nice. Keep it up. Sidebar. I often, you know, I've heard the story of the old hobo walking down the front of the church and everybody judging him and going, you know, and the guy saying, that could be your next elder down the road. But all I have to say, anybody new that comes in, doesn't, Christ brings us the community that he wants us to have at every different step in our circle of life. Cherish as you got where you are at the time. Be heartbroken if some move on, yet cherish the fact that they're part of your life. Bob has been here 8 years.
Seems like yesterday. Yeah. I heard every one of them. All right, well, thank you. I appreciate all your input, and let's close in prayer. Father, we do thank you for all of the ways that you have brought us into community here at Trinity, and I pray that you would increase it and that you would help us to recognize our finiteness and our dependence on others, Lord, in healthy ways, Lord, and that we would contribute to one another and love one another in the way that you intended the church to do. And I pray that you would just give us your grace now as we go from this place, that you give us strength. Pray that you provide a great job for Rodney, and that you would help the Kennedys to be able to adopt Asher, and we just pray that you would give us all your strength in Jesus' name.